Hello and welcome back to Lutheran Witness Podcast. I'm your host, Roy Askins. Here on the Lutheran Witness Podcast, we share for you the articles on the Lutheran Witness website, but we also have special opportunities where we get to hear from guests who have written for the magazine. This month of September, you have two special guests. We actually got to listen to Dr. Adams. If it hasn't come out yet, it will come out soon. And he talks about the limits of archaeology, which was a delightful discussion that I had with Stacey Egger and Dr. Adams from the seminary in St. Louis. Today, however, we have with us Sarah Reinsel, who wrote an article on manuscripts for the September issue. And she's going to talk about manuscripts and a little bit go beyond what we had in the original article in the September issue of The Witness. Before we do that, however, we want to give you a quick shout out to our podcast partners, KFUO, Christ for You, anytime, anywhere, kfuo.org. Check them out. We're really grateful for their support and help. If you're interested in getting a copy of this month's issue, which is on archaeology and apologetics, visit cph.org/witness where you can subscribe, or visit our website, witness.lcms.org, to learn more about the issue and why you might want a copy. So let's just dive right on in. Sarah, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. It's good to be here.
Thank you. Thank you for coming in, and thank you for writing the article. I know you really enjoyed this article on manuscripts, biblical manuscripts. You have a little bit of a background and a history with manuscripts in your studies. Give us what was kind of your interest? Why are you interested in manuscripts?
Sure, yeah. So a few years ago, I had the opportunity to get my master's in medieval English literature at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. And as a part of my coursework, I took classes in paleography and codicology. Paleography is the study of handwriting, and then codicology is the study of manuscripts more generally. And it's important to do that as a medievalist because all of your texts originate as handwritten copies, which may have been copied out again and again and again over the course of centuries. And so you have to rely on those in order to get to your nice printed copy of Chaucer, or in my case, it was Julian of Norwich was who I studied in particular.
Fantastic. So what were some of your favorite manuscripts, like as you were studying the manuscripts and then the handwriting? What's a couple of key insights that would be interesting for people to know?
Yeah, so for the paleography class that I took, I had to go to the library, and it was an interesting experience walking into the library and asking to see a manuscript that was 600 or 700 years old, and they said, "Oh sure." And then the librarian, the one I got to work on was actually a scroll, and she just pulled it out and rolled it out on the table for me and said, "Have at it." Yeah,
that's terrifying.
It was awesome. Yeah. And they have rules and things like you're not supposed to have nail polish on your hands, but you are allowed to touch it.
Really? Do you have gloves on or something like that?
No, you don't even need to have gloves on. Yeah. So the idea is that the easiest way to not damage a manuscript is just kind of handle it normally, right? So gloves might cause you to tear or be rougher with something than you actually intend. And like the oils from your fingers aren't actually going to do that much. I mean,
wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah, I know. Isn't that cool? I mean, and I think that speaks to how durable manuscripts are too. Mm-hmm. Like they're, we think of them as these really fragile things, but they've been around a while and they'll probably continue to be around for a while, maybe longer than all of our computer servers. Who knows? But anyways, so what I worked on in particular was and this was more of just an exercise in how to read and decipher old handwriting. So I had to look at a passage. It was just like a long account of all of the kings of England, and it was written in Middle English in a certain kind of handwriting, and I had to sit down and decipher what it said. It was actually quite difficult to do.
What made it difficult? What about the handwriting that people don't expect? Because we as you mentioned in your article, we're used to the idea of a printed script. It's all very consistent. What made it difficult to decipher that script for people who have no clue why that would be difficult? Right.
Yeah. So the letters are all smushed together. There are lots of spelling variations in Middle English in particular. There aren't any spelling rules. And telling what individual letters are, it could vary. Sometimes the scribe would go back and forth between the shape of the letter, like the shape of the letter A or something like that. And it is, quite tricky. I guess. And it kind of depends on, that's not to say that scribes have bad handwriting. It's more like, sometimes it's hard to read grandma's handwriting in your Christmas card too, because it's in cursive. But then in other cases, and I go into this in my article more, in other cases, the handwriting's quite crystal clear, and it really just depends on what kind of script. So
that's really cool. That's interesting. Well, let's turn and shift into talking a bit about the manuscripts of the New Testament and the transmission of these manuscripts, the tradition of passing down the New Testament from the original autographs of the New Testament, those documents that record what the apostles and Paul wrote down. Why do we even need to ask this question about whether or not we have accurate copies? Why are we having the conversation about transmission of manuscripts?
Sure. Yeah. That's the $1 million question I ask. And talking about accuracy with something like poetry or like a work of literature is one thing, and then accuracy when you're talking about God's word is ups the ante a little bit. But yeah, so I kind of think about this conversation in two respects, or in two senses of accurate. Like there's accurate in the sense of, was the original author being honest, right? Or, was everything made up? How do we know it happened 2,000 years ago? That's kind of one bone of contention that you see a lot. And then the other one is, okay, well, is it accurate in the sense of, was the manuscript copied out accurately every single time over the course of hundreds and hundreds of years? And so I think I'll speak more to that second one. The first one is, I don't know. Yeah, the first one is just kind of not as interesting of a question to me, right? It's like we want to, I think it's better just, it's good to trust our original authors, obviously, because it's God's inspired word. But then, we might also say, well, if we're concerned about something getting copied out accurately, does that mean that errors got introduced, right? Mm-hmm. So if you imagine that you're a highly trained scribe and you spend 8 to 10 hours a day, maybe more, sitting down and looking at an old version and writing out a new version in your very, very best handwriting, there are little mistakes are bound to creep in, right? Your eye might skip a word, and you drop a word, or you drop a letter, or you might swap the order of words or letters inadvertently, or you might kind of repeat a word twice or something, right? And we would think of these as typos, little spelling errors, but the things that are so easy to catch that there's no real ambiguity introduced. And so sometimes you'll hear about different biblical manuscripts being corrected. And a lot of times it's just a more recent scribe correcting an earlier scribe's mistaken work, because I don't know, maybe that scribe was tired that day and working in the dark or working late or something like that. You can imagine. And that it's my understanding that most variants is what scholars would call them. Most variants between different manuscripts of, say, the Gospel of Mark, right? Most of those creep in, but they really only amount to differences in spelling, basically. Right.
So, like inadvertent mistakes, things that are not intentionally creating problems or not intentionally causing harm to the text itself.
Right. No deliberate theological changes, no deliberate, revisions. Yeah, I think there are a couple of famous ones. Like I was reading about one clarification that I think happens in Luke, where it was originally Jesus's parents are referred to, and then later it got changed to Joseph and Jesus' mother or something like that, just to kind of clarify the idea of the virgin birth. But I mean, that was one of the only examples I could come across of, okay, well, that's a deliberate change and was intended to clarify a theological issue. But
how might the transition or tradition of passing down the manuscript of the New Testament differ from other non-religious secular manuscripts, especially in terms of, we're talking about the reliability of the text that we have. Mm-hmm. How does the reliability of scriptures compare with the reliability of, say, Caesar's Gallic Wars?
Right. Yeah. And that's an example I brought up in the article. And I guess coming into this as a medievalist, I was amazed at the amount of, the wealth of biblical manuscripts that we have available to us, because in a lot of cases, there just isn't simply that much to go off of. So in my case, one text, a medieval text that I worked on, there are only 3 manuscripts of it, period. Oh. So it survived. And you got to touch one of them, which is terrifying.
Right.
Yeah. It survived, just kind of good fortune in a lot of cases. I mean, and then my other favorite story this is another medieval example, but Beowulf. So the famous Anglo-Saxon epic, there's only one copy of it in existence, and it survived a big house fire in the 1700s, So we very nearly no one would ever have read Beowulf.
Wow.
But that's just simply not the case with the Bible, which I just thought was amazing, that you can just see how much it was treasured and how faithful people were to it, because it just got copied out again and again and again, and it's everywhere. And from the get-go, it's everywhere. It's in different languages. It's, we have manuscripts from all over the ancient Near East and very soon Europe as well. And it seems like there's no meddling with the text either. The other thing that I thought was really amazing about this tradition is it's completely continuous as well. So in a lot of cases, you have, say, like 10 manuscripts of something total, period. And the earliest manuscript is still 1,000 years removed from when this ancient author was originally writing. So that's the case for a lot of Plato's work and for Julius Caesar, for Thucydides, right? A lot of these really, really famous ancient authors, what we're going off of was a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, done over the course of hundreds of years. And we have no idea what may have changed in between then. I mean, I'm inclined to not be skeptical about those other ones either. Like, I think that, most of the time, the people who were bothering to copy these things out were monks and monasteries, right? So they were very well educated. They knew they knew wisdom when they saw it, I think. And so they were pretty careful in preserving these sorts of things. But still, I think there's somewhere around 6,000 manuscripts of the Bible, and that's just an astronomical number.
Yeah. Well, I've heard somewhere, and I think it's John Warwick Montgomery, but he may not be the only one to make the argument, who basically says if you are going to contend that the transmission of the New Testament from earliest times to now is not accurate, then you basically have to dismiss everything we know prior to the invention of the printing press, because we just don't have enough manuscripts in comparison to what we have in the New Testament.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good quote. I want to look that up. But that's my sense too. Is it's a peculiarly modern attitude to doubt everything, right?
Yeah,
and to sort of call into question the authorship of ancient things or the truth of ancient things, when in reality, like, nobody before, I don't know, the 1700s was doing that.
Exactly.
It's just not a way that humans think.
Yeah.
Usually.
Yeah.
But
let's talk a little bit more about the actual manuscripts that we are discussing here. There's a whole bunch of different types of manuscripts. You've got papyrus and codices and all these other things. Kind of give us a rundown on the manuscripts of the New Testament. What are they? Kind of what are some of the terms involved with some of them?
Sure. Yeah, so there are two big categories of biblical New Testament manuscripts. There are the papyri. So those are the most ancient ones. Most of them date from the 1st, 2nd century. Well, no, sorry, none date from the 1st century. Sorry. Most are from the 2nd or 3rd centuries. And they're made out of papyrus, which is a kind of paper made out of plant pulp, basically, and smushed together. And it's not very durable. And so all of the fragments that we have they're just little bits, right? Mm-hmm. And a lot of them were discovered in places like ancient trash heaps, right? Kind of a cool story, archaeological story in and of itself. But so those are our oldest ones. Studying papyrus is really helpful because it's what we have that's closest to the autographs. So when you hear the word autograph, you might think you're John Hancock, right? But the autograph just means auto, like self, right, and graph writing. So the original writing, the original author, John or Paul or whoever actually, put pen to paper. We don't have any of those. And the reason we don't have any of them, I think, is pretty obvious. They got circulated a lot and copied out a lot and wore out. But we do have evidence of from these different papyrus fragments that's very close to the original, right, in terms of time. And the earliest one we have is a fragment of the Gospel of John, which is just a few decades removed from when John himself would have been writing, which is pretty cool. Yeah. Then the other big category is...
Before you go on to the next big category, let me explain a little bit about this idea of the manuscripts being passed around. I think maybe some people don't realize the original autographs weren't just kind of sealed away in a museum. That's what we would have done with them, right? We would put them behind glass, seal them away in a museum. When the evangelists were writing their gospels, when Paul was writing his letters, he sent them out. What happened to them? Where did they go?
Yeah, they would have gotten passed around, and copies would have been made from them, or maybe they would have been read aloud in churches or that sort of a thing. But my sense is that a lot of people got to touch them, which is very cool. And recently this scholar named Craig Evans is making the case that they would have been circulating for up to 200 years after they were written. So they're fragile, but not that fragile. And yeah, so which if they were circulating for up to 200 years after they were written, then that means that a lot of our earliest manuscripts have a very good chance of coming from
the original. From the autograph. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, the other great category of a manuscript.
Right. So that's the codex. So codex is a fancy word for a book. So some codices, that's the plural, were made out of papyrus, and you can imagine them basically as you would imagine a book to be, pages sewn together into some kind of a binding. But around the 4th century, maybe a little bit earlier, vellum began to be used for these codices. And vellum it's a kind of parchment. It's very, very high quality and very expensive to make. It comes from an animal skin, right? So you'd have to go through this whole process of skinning an animal and stretching out its hide and then scraping all the hair off and then treating it with something acidic to whiten it and get rid of all of the I don't know, animal stuff. and it turns into this very fine paper and is very, very durable. And that's what most manuscripts we have are made out of. And the great codices are the obvious starting point for talking about this category.
Your article primarily focused on 4 of these codices, the great uncials. Am I saying that right?
I would say uncial.
Uncial. Okay, we'll go with that. What's an uncial?
Right. So an uncial is just a name for a kind of handwriting. So actually I'll differentiate uncial from like a cursive script, right? So uncial it's all capital letters. It's written continuously, so there's no spacing, there's no punctuation, nothing separating the words at all. And I guess people must have been used to reading that way.
Isn't some of it also that they're primarily reading out loud? They weren't reading quietly. So most of our punctuation breaks are for reading quietly, is my understanding.
I had never thought of it that way. I always thought of it as a space saving measure, but no, that makes sense to me. That makes much more sense to me.
Well, so they were used to reading out loud, and then as you're reading out loud, it forces you to read a little bit slower.
Right.
But then I suppose also some of it probably had to do with the invention of the printing press, when you could be a little more precise too. But
sure.
Anyways, I always find it fascinating that they just smushed all the letters together.
Right. Me too. That sounds difficult to read to me. But so that's what an uncial script is versus a cursive script, which is much smaller. It was developed eventually because it was quicker, right? If you're not removing the pen from the paper, then you can simply write more quickly. But it's also harder to read in its own way too. But originally, all of the Greek New Testament was copied out in this uncial script. And that's kind of what categorizes the 4 great uncials together, is they're really remarkable for their clarity and for the quality of the manuscript itself. Like, okay, this was clearly an expensive endeavor in a lot of ways. But then they're also valued, of course, for their accuracy and their completeness and their great age. They're very, very old.
Right. Yeah. Well, and so the idea here being many of the, especially the papyrus, the papyri, those are just small fragments, small pieces. Many of even the codices, I'm understanding, are not full versions of the New Testament, right? They might be a few books here and there, but these are more complete in terms of containing most of the New Testament. That sort of thing, right?
Right. Okay. Yeah.
What are the 4 great uncials?
Yeah, so they go by their Latin names, which they're very handy names because they'll tell us a lot about where they come from. There's Codex Sinaiticus, and you can kind of hear the word Sinai in there. So that one comes from the monastery of St. Catherine's, which is on Mount Sinai in Egypt. It's a monastery. It's a Greek Orthodox monastery that's been there since the 3rd century, 4th century. It's very, very old. So that's the first one. Codex Vaticanus is probably the most famous one, and you can hear the word Vaticanus in there. And the Vatican Library has housed it since the 15th century. And then there's Codex Alexandrinus, which is from Alexandria, Egypt. And then Codex Ephremi, which you can hear the word Ephraim in there, which that might not be a familiar name or might not have any significance off the bat. And Codex Ephremi is really interesting because it's named for what the book originally was. So it's something called a palimpsest. And what happened was sometimes scribes would recycle manuscripts, so to speak. And so they would scrape off what was originally on the manuscript. In this case, the New Testament, which, which I guess speaks to they had plenty of copies of the New Testament that they could recycle.
When I read that in your article, I was just blown away. I was like, of all the things to scrape off, I don't know that I would have the courage to scrape off the New Testament and write my words over the top of it.
Yeah, I don't know. But I mean, it's still legible. Like, you can still kind of see it underneath. But then the writings of St. Ephraim the Syrian are written on top of it. So, I mean, I guess they must have really needed some paper. I don't know.
That's incredible.
But it also kind of gives me a sense too, and okay, this is kind of a side note, but of just how people thought about books in, 1,000 years ago or longer. I guess like just because something was really, really, really old didn't mean it was valuable. They probably said, oh, we have plenty of accurate, wonderful copies of the New Testament. We don't need to save this ancient one, which to our ears would say, what are you doing?
Yes.
But anyways, it's just, I mean, I mostly say that as I think the scribes in these libraries and these monasteries knew what they were doing.
Yeah.
From. Anyways, okay, so those are the 4 great codices, or the 4 great uncials. You'll hear them called both things.
Codex Vaticanus had an interesting history that you were able to dig up. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so that's one it's very, very well traveled. Another word that scholars use to talk about manuscripts is the word provenance, which just means where a manuscript has been, or where it was from originally and where it's been. So who's owned it over the course of its 2,000 years of life. And so Codex Vaticanus and Sinaiticus too, actually, we can't say this for sure. I want to believe it because it would be cool. But it's possible that Vaticanus was one of the 50 Bibles that Constantine commissioned as the church historian Eusebius tells us that there's this growing church in Constantinople just needed more Bibles. And so Constantine wanted to meet that need and get a whole bunch of Bibles copied out for them, right? And this is shortly after he legalized Christianity and the Roman Empire is becoming Christian very quickly. So Vaticanus is old enough to have been one of those manuscripts, but we don't know for sure. But so we could say it may have started its life in Constantinople. I think a lot of scholars say it may have started its life in Egypt too. And then after that, so assuming that maybe it did start its life in Constantinople, we do have a paper trail of, okay, it could have been moved to Rome when the Byzantine Empire fell in 1453 to the Ottoman Turks, right? So there's this very famous story of their final capture of Constantinople, which is the undefeatable city in a lot of ways. That's kind of cool to think about, somebody making off with that manuscript, running to Rome, intentionally saving it from the Turks. But that's kind of another part where that's conjecture, but it's interesting. The earliest record we have of it being in the Vatican Library, I think is 1475, or I think some scholars say 1481. So sometime in the 15th century, we know the Vatican Library has Vaticanus. But the story does not end there. Under the reign of Napoleon, when he invades Italy, he takes this codex back to France with him. But thankfully, it was eventually returned to the Vatican Library. But it's kind of interesting that I guess by that point, the value of this manuscript was known enough that Napoleon would want it in Paris.
That's incredible. What a great story. Last question, as you have looked at the manuscript tradition and thought about what we've received, how these monks and these monasteries have passed it on, what is it and how has it encouraged you in terms of understanding the text that we have before us, that we study, that we have in all these various English translations, but kind of the tradition that brought us this Greek manuscript so that we can have it in English? What have you, what insights have you had from it?
Yeah. So I guess just speaking as a lay person, I've never thought beyond comparing different translations of the Bible, right? So I know there are different merits to ESV, or, the reason why the NIV was commissioned, or the King James Version's famous for its English, but may not have been like the most accurate tradition or the most accurate translation, or based on the most accurate rendering of the Greek in the first place. And I had never really thought beyond that. But then kind of combining my previous training as a medievalist with this and thinking about, okay, so where are we actually getting the Greek from? The phrase, the word of the Lord endures forever, just kept running through my mind. And I was really just very moved by how many faithful people have touched the word of God, copied it out, remained faithful to it, valued it, and, went to the effort of preserving it. It's really, really, really amazing. And it also, I think, the sheer difference between the biblical manuscript tradition and any other manuscript I've studied, right? It's just, this is truly the Word of God. Just nothing holds a candle to, no other human effort holds a candle to what has been preserved here.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for joining us on the podcast today. It's great to have you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
And for those of you out there listening to the Lutheran Witness podcast, thank you for listening and learning more about the manuscript tradition of the New Testament, this Greek text that we have and that has been translated for us, that we can hear God's word, receive it in our ears, and receive this proclamation in which we receive also the forgiveness of our sins. As always, thank you for listening and learning how to interpret the world from a Lutheran perspective.